Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to two individuals with direct family ties to the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision that established the legality of segregation more than 60 years before Dr. Tate bravely faced that angry mob. In 2009, Phoebe Ferguson and Keith Plessy co-founded the Plessy and Ferguson Initiative to spark important conversations about finding unity and fostering mutual understanding. Together, they visit schools, colleges and universities, and other organizations to raise awareness of the court ruling, to examine its effects, and advocate for understanding one another's histories as essential to forging peace. Before they join me on stage, I'd like to show this short video that tells their story.
My great-grandfather's first cousin was a shoemaker. He challenged the Separate Car Act of Louisiana, which mandated separate accommodations for people of different races. He was elected because of his complexion, that he would appear to be someone of the white race. There was this thing called a one-drop rule. If you had one drop of African blood in you, you were mixed race. He boarded the train car, and the conductor, as well as the arresting officer, were all in on this plan to fight the segregation laws of Louisiana. So the conductor approached him and asked him, was he a person of color? And he responded, yes, I'm a person of color. I purchased my first-class ticket, and I'm gonna go to Covington on this train. My name is Keith Plessy, and my great-grandfather's cousin's name was Homer Plessy.
I never realized that my great-great-grandfather was the judge in the infamous case of Plessy versus Ferguson. He ruled against Homer Plessy. This is one of the three most important civil rights cases in American legal history, and we are descendants of it.
Our foundation is a flip on the script as opposed to Plessy versus Ferguson. We are Plessy and Ferguson.
We're dedicated to identifying historic sites where African-American history has occurred but not been recognized by the state.
The Plessy versus Ferguson case resulted in the United States Supreme Court adopting separate but equal as the law of the land.
With that, I'd like to invite Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson to join me on the stage. Keith and Phoebe, welcome to NAFSA. It's fitting that the NAFSA annual meeting is in New Orleans because it's such an international city with a culture that's a unique blend of so many international influences. Could you talk about the city's international history and why it's important for us to understand that now?
Sure. Well, long before it was called New Orleans, it was called Bobancha. And the native people of this land gathered in this place, which we now call New Orleans, and that spirit was, in the Choctaw language, it was the land of other tongues. And all of the tribes met in this spot. The same spirit is in this place when other people came from countries around the world. And it was a melting pot for this particular area. And we later became a port city after that. And, you know, the slave trade, goods going up the river, it supplied basically the whole country, right from the mouth of Mississippi.
And of course, it was originally founded by the French. And, you know, in the late 18th century, it was Acadianos coming down from Canada who discovered the mouth of the Mississippi and began to build you know, small towns, but New Orleans itself was founded in 1718 and by the French, and was a very, I would say sort of a very unique small culture of French-speaking people, right? And then for a small period of time, it was also run by the Spanish. And then again, for a very short period of time, from 1802 to 1803, it was again owned by the French before being sold to America, as part of America.
And I hope that our attendees have had a chance to experience some of that international flair in the city as they've been here this week for the conference. Now, I want to jump right into Plessy and Ferguson and the Supreme Court case. And many people are not familiar with the Plessy versus Ferguson court case. Could you give us a short summary of the case and why it's so important in understanding American history?
Okay.
Well, what Phoebe was saying about it's changing hands so many times. Under Spanish colonial rule, it wasn't considered part of the Union. And we were credited recently, recent times, with being part of the American Revolution. Later on, we had the Battle of New Orleans and the Civil War. And during the Civil War, you know, we had the amendments were written, 13th, 1st, 14th, 15th. And when Reconstruction occurred, a lot of progress was made and a lot of rights were gained from freed slaves, and Reconstruction followed. And with post-Reconstruction is where the Plessy case came along, because with those rights being gained during Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction is where those rights were being taken away. And the Citizens Committee was a group of people who had ancestors that fought with the Amistad case long before the Plessy case. And like I said, during Reconstruction, they were responsible, some of their people were responsible for developing the 1868 Constitution,
Right.
Louisiana Constitution. And the gains that came from it, you know, we had plenty, you'd say a massive amount of black people were voted into offices. And they saw this progress happening, and then slowly, with a lot of violence and a lot of resistance, America turned its back on this area, on the South.
Well,
When the troops were leaving, you know, you had all these massacres that occurred, and from those massacres, people watched rules change, laws being written, discriminatory laws, and the separate call law was one of those laws. And the community where the Citizens Committee came from, these people were, I would say, in the 1700s, free people of color came to the United States. And they were intelligent folks. They didn't come here as slaves. They helped design the city. And those folks were the people who were involved in the Citizens Committee.
yeah, they were made up of 18 gentlemen who were mostly Creoles of color, who had been educated in France. They were politically savvy. They were also businessmen and writers, lawyers. And as Keith said, several had been involved in writing the 1868 Constitution, which was the Constitution that Louisiana and other southern states had to write in order to be accepted back into the Union after the Civil War. And it was very significant because that was also the first Bill of Rights, allowing for racial integration and equal access. But the 1868 Constitution is so important because it was written by 49 black members delegates and 49 white delegates. So it should stand out in textbooks as a moment in history that we should replicate and honor what went into it. And when Keith was talking about, you know, what happened after that, there was a period before 1877 when the Union troops were removed from the South during the new presidential election, where New Orleans had integrated schools, integrated accommodations, free people of, I mean, everybody was at this point a free person. But the massacres I wanted to talk about was around voting. So at every opportunity there was for a major election, whether it was in the city of New Orleans or around the state, the white supremacists basically, you know, came in, wanted to stop that effort, because at one point, I think even as late as 1888, half of the voting population in Louisiana was black, and that was causing a real problem for the white, you know, patriarchs who wanted to maintain their dominance over the, you know, policies, politics, and population.
Well, Louisiana's separate car law came along in 1890. And there were several separate car laws that were being passed across the South. We were not the first. There were others that Tennessee was like 10 years ahead of us, 1880. They had passed their segregation laws on the trains, passenger trains. And when it came to us in Louisiana, the gentlemen that were responsible for that 1868 Constitution and who had benevolent organizations that existed even before the Civil War, they got together and they were going to change that. It was an intricate case because it wasn't just, you know, people may say, well, Homer Plessy refused to get off a train. You know, it sounded like a random act, but it wasn't. It was a planned act, and the railroad was part of it. The railroad was against it because it cost them a lot of money to have separate cars, and it was hard for them. They held them responsible for a person's race. So you had to, and in New Orleans, as you know, certain people know, a lot of people may appear to be white, but they're not. So Homer Plessy was one of those people. He appeared to be a white person. So in his case, he was actually the second case. There was a musician named Daniel Daydum, whose picture is in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And there's no picture of Homer Plessy, just to clear that up. We searched for that picture for so long and we can't find one. But Daniel Daydum was the first case, Homer Plessy was the second case. And when he tried it, Daniel was trying the interstate travel on trains, and his case was thrown out. But Homer Plessy challenged the Louisiana state law, the intrastate law. And when he challenged that law, it was directly facing the Louisiana separate car law. Now, as a result of him being arrested, in that time, like 1890 when it was written, the very next year in 1891, there were 11 Italians who were assassinated. And it's not like they shot them on the street. They were charged with the murder of a sheriff back then, a detective, David Hennessy. And they were on trial, and they were acquitted. But a mob ensued on the jail, took them from the jail, hung them in Congo Square, and shot them from the ropes as they were hanging. And that can describe the climate that Homer Plessy had to face in 1892 when he stepped on that train and challenged that law. And it was so well orchestrated that when he got on the train, nobody knew he was black. You know, the conductor was in on it, the detective was in on it. So the detective was waiting when the conductor said, "Oh, you're a black man?" And he said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Well, you got to move to the train of your race, the train car of your race." And he said, "No, I'm refusing. I'm going to Covington." Bought my ticket, got a first-class ticket, and I'm going to Covington. So they threw him off the train, and the detective was hired, as well as the conductor, to make that scene. When they got him off the train, they whisked him off to jail, because he could have been hanging from a rope. They got him to jail, kept him in there, and they carefully were able to get him out. The bail was paid, and that case was intentionally done to move it to U.S. Supreme Court. And it was a local case in the beginning, but their intention was to go to the United States Supreme Court and change the laws across the South.
So I want to pull out two things from what you've both said. Number one is for us to grasp the prevalence of racial violence in the city. So we're moving through these spaces today, and we see plants, and we have people walking around, but these are places where people were violently murdered in public spaces. And I'm glad that you painted that as the backdrop of what was the sense of urgency for people to address these racial inequalities in their society. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is in the video, it first talks about Rosa Parks, then comes back to Homer Plessy. And in so many of the textbooks, if these events are mentioned at all, it sounds like it's a random and passive event. But what you've described has so many complicated parts to it in terms of setting the stage to act out the event, but also all of the legal challenges that have to be addressed. This is really complicated, and it really shows how these communities came together from a legal standpoint. They had to know the history, they had to understand who the players were. This is a very complicated set of activities that have to occur. And I really enjoyed the way you talked about the Citizens Committee and their role, because it gives the Black community and the colored community a much more sense of agency into why they were able to stand up and address these laws. So if you could just talk about you two and your extraordinary story as well. So you both grew up in New Orleans, but you didn't meet each other until you were adults. Can you tell us the story of how you met and when you realized that you could do important work together?
Well, I'll start, or if you want to start, you can.
All right. Never told the story before.
Coming from two different walks of life, in the 7th Ward, where I grew up, and Phoebe was uptown, I would say we probably would have never met each other without an author named Keith Weldon Medley. His book, I know we have our book together, we're going to talk about that later, but Keith Weldon Medley wrote this book about both our ancestors, and Phoebe's holding a copy.
I've only read it once or twice.
But Keith did some in-depth research, and I was honored to meet him in 1996 when the 100th anniversary of the case was being observed by several universities around the country, and they all converged here in New Orleans. And I got a chance to meet Constance Baker Motley, John Hope Franklin. There were plenty, big name, Ogletree, did a mock trial of the case. And you know, I got to meet all those folks. Even met some people in my family that I was not really close to, and now we're very close. Keith did all that. He actually introduced me to my white relatives in Lake Charles Parish, and we still talk to each other now. We have a good relationship, and you know, I met him like that, and I knew him from 1996 all the way till Phoebe met him. And she showed me so many things about the family that I didn't know. And he did the same thing for Phoebe.
I think he spent, what, 25 years researching just the New Orleans story of Plessy versus Ferguson. So he really paints an incredible picture of what the climate was, and who the Citizens Committee members were and their importance in the city. And I remember, so Keith had already, when Keith Medley was writing this book, you and Keith met, right, during this, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't actually find out that I was related to the judge until 2003-ish. And I was living in New York, and I got a phone call from a gentleman whose name was Plessy, oddly enough, and he said he'd been looking for me for 10 years, and the reason was that he had bought my great-great-grandfather's house here on Henry Clay Avenue. He said, you know, the judge in Plessy versus Ferguson. And I said, hang on a minute. And it was weird because I had just received a box from my sister full of family stuff, and all I knew that on top of the box was an envelope that said Ferguson genealogy. So I'm on the phone with him, and he's waiting, and I pull out the envelope, and I look down the genealogy, and I see Judge John Howard Ferguson, and I go, oh my God. I always wondered, I mean, my name was Ferguson, and I was from New Orleans, but why didn't anyone ever mention it? I'm not sure my father, who was an only child, knew, because in the Judge Ferguson's obit, it does not mention the case at all. In any case, that started my, immediate phone calls to try to find out more about the judge. And the first thing that I found out within the first 5 minutes was that, no, we don't have any papers on the judge, but there's been a book just published that has a whole chapter about your great-great-grandfather. And the author is Keith Weldon Medley. So I attempted to track him down, and through one of our institutions, and they said, well, we can't give you his number, but we'll call him and let you know you're looking for him. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. This man was so happy that he now had Plessy and Ferguson that I had to immediately get on a plane and come meet him. And so I came to New Orleans in 2004, and Keith's very first book signing, he invited me to his first book signing, and maybe you should pick it up there.
Well, just the way Phoebe set it up, it was all Keith setting these things up. And the way he did it, I knew I was going to meet a Ferguson. He called me and said, hey, would you like to meet a Ferguson? I said, yeah, Keith. I've been talking to him for a few years, So I said, sure. And he never told Phoebe that she was going to meet a Plessy. So when we got to the Preservation Resource Center, which is not too far from here, he introduced us and we shook hands, and Phoebe started apologizing for history. So she was like, from slavery to segregation, Jim Crow, everybody, So I just kind of slowed it down. I knew what was happening, so she was surprised, and I was like, hey, we didn't do that. That's not us. We can do something different. It's no longer Plessy versus Ferguson. It's Plessy and Ferguson.
Seriously?
We shook hands. Yeah.
That is not embellished at all. That's not made up, well, except the part about slavery. But he really, without missing a beat, he said, it's no longer Plessy versus Ferguson, it's Plessy and Ferguson. And, you know, I'll just say there was a big sigh of relief. And the next thing he did was invite me over to his family for gumbo and bread pudding and all the good things that...
Don't forget the potato salad.
Oh, yeah, the potato salad. Now, you see, here's a difference that we haven't really worked out yet. In his family, when there is a holiday and they have gumbo, they have it with potato salad. In my family, I never heard of having potato salad with gumbo. Mm-hmm. So we still have some differences to work out here.
But it was good.
It was good.
So now that we know how you two met, you have this wonderful foundation that does so much great work within the city. Can you tell us more about the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation?
Okay. It took a few years for us. I was still going back and forth to New York and coming here, and finally decided right after Katrina to move back. And so it was like 2006, and we kept kind of meeting each other, and we were influenced by friends who felt that there was something more that could be done with this union. And so, you know, when we spoke with people, we both had the same experience of people saying, oh my God, that gives me goosebumps. I can't believe you were friends. And we were thinking, seriously, folks, it's 120 years later. It's not really, you know, but the thing that was so key is that this case and its legacies is so embedded in the American conscience as, you know, the thing that caused the most division in this country for such a long time. You know, for 58 years, as you pointed out, until the Supreme Court unanimously overturned it in Brown v. Board of Ed. So anyway, you know, we said, if there's something that we can do with our relationship to bring about some positive change or inspire others to come together across differences, that change is possible, then let's do it. And so we started the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation in 2009. Mm-hmm. And we're now the Plessy and Ferguson Initiative. Since we don't actually give away gobs of money, we prefer to take on certain initiatives and implement them, and like our historic marker program. And since some of our pillars of our organization are truth-seeking, justice, and memorialization, putting up historical markers to African American history, achievement, and resilience is a core program for us. And we put up the 2009 marker, the day that we announced the foundation for Plessy v. Ferguson, that marker. And then 1 year later, we partnered with Dr. Tate and the Leona Tate Foundation for Change to put up the next historical marker in front of McDonough 19 that told the story of how that school was integrated. And that was an incredibly moving experience. I just want to take a second. Leona, you don't mind, do you? If I just take a second and that was the 60th anniversary. Oh, I guess I'm not speaking loud enough. That was the 60th anniversary, 50th anniversary of the integration of McDonough 19, and I'm just forgetting Ruby Bridges School.
Well, the U.S. Marshals.
That's where I was going.
Marched them into the school.
Yeah.
There were 3 of them that were at the ceremony to unveil the marker. And I think, if I'm right, Leona, Dr. Tate, if I'm right, I think you had a 6-year-old grandchild there at the unveiling. So that was magic. You know, she was 6 years old when it all happened. Her grandchild was 6 years old.
Wow.
When we unveiled that marker 50 years after it happened.
But can you imagine? I mean, to have those 3 marshals come for that historical marker unveiling with Leona, Gail, and Tessie, now grown up. When the marshals came, they wore their yellow bands that they had worn all year as they escorted them into school. And I'll never forget the day that this occurred, and Leona, Gail, and Tessie standing at the top of the stairs with the marshals, crying, saying that they thought that this day would never come, where they would see an integrated audience and honor their legacy. So that's sort of a testament why it's important to memorialization is important, because this history was unknown. Their history was unknown. Ruby Bridges' history was known for various reasons. Everyone knew that name, but they did not know the story of these 3 6-year-olds who bravely attended the school by themselves for an entire year.
Thank you for that. I want to give people in the audience a chance to start thinking about your questions, because I have one more question left for Keith and Phoebe. So there are 2 microphones over here. They're labeled. If you have questions, please be thinking of them so that you can come down to the microphone. And I so appreciate you both really giving some texture to what that looks like. And for people to imagine, if you have a 6-year-old, if you've ever had a 6-year-old child, what it would be like to send your child down the street into the throngs of a spitting, angry mob of people who are simply angry that your child is trying to get an education. And that really gives you a sense of what it was like to live in the segregated South. And because you are both talking about that sense of place and the work that you do in creating and setting up these historical markers, I'm curious to know, since many people, it's either their first time in New Orleans or they really haven't been able to explore the city yet, are there markers that are in the French Quarter, close to the hotel, or any place in the city that they could visit to really get a sense of your work and the history of New Orleans?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would encourage everyone to buy the book together. The story of our 5 markers that exist here in the city is in that book, and it tells how we came about getting the history and putting those markers together. But I want to go right back to Dr. Tate, if you don't mind.
Please do, yes. Let's do it.
The transformation that happens when a marker is put up and the history is brought to life, and people can stand there and read it and understand it when it wasn't told before. And I would just say the transformation is, and I know you said visit where the markers are, but I would say visit the TEP Center. Okay. Because the transformation has happened. That marker started out with an event like the 50th anniversary and all the emotion, and I would say those marshals, amongst them, I think maybe one might still be living. And the TEP Center is where, in the owner's words, in Dr. Tate's words, I would say, she said, this is where they learned about hatred and discrimination, and this is the place where it's going to end, because it has transformed, not from just a school building, but it has, in its first floor area, there's an interpretation center to talk about what happened to Leona, Gail, and Tessie, the TEP, T-E-P. The last names are Tate, Etienne, Prevost, so the TEP Center represents their three names. And inside that first floor area, you have the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, who teach, they are teaching anti-racism classes. And I think Beloved is in there as well. And on the second levels of the school are 25 elderly affordable living spaces. So in that one building, you're taking care of the elderly, you're taking care of the young, and you're preventing a lot of damage emotionally from hatred and discrimination by teaching those anti-racism classes. And I would say visit there. You know, that's the result of one marker. That marker stopped the school board from tearing the school down in 2010. And I want to say this too, that when we formed our organization in 2009, around the same time, Dr. Tate was forming the Leona Tate Foundation for Change. So the stars were aligned for us. Yeah. You know, we walked into this blindly and without knowing what the next day would bring. But we see now that when you take one step forward, and I'll be so far as to say God takes 10 for you.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to get to, well, let's give them both a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you both. I see we have some audience questions, and I just want to make sure that we can get through all of our questions today. So please be very concise, give yourself a very brief introduction, and keep your questions very short. Thank you. We'll go to number one first.
Good evening. My name is Deidre Coleman. I'm with the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. And just want to say, first of all, thank you for your story. Last year I did a course in racial identity, in the Plessy versus Ferguson case was one of the main topics in that course. And so I didn't know about this work that you're doing now, so thank you for that, and thank you for just bridging that gap. My question is, can you kind of talk about how some of the adversities that you may have experienced in this project, in this effort, and how you worked around or navigated through them to continue your work?
Did you say some of the universities?
Adversities. Okay. Sorry. Some of the adversities that you experienced in your work together and how you combated those.
Well, we
argue now and then. But,
well, actually, I would say the track record for us has been very little adversity and negativity. It's almost as though, you know, when you're doing something right, there's no violation. You know, there's nothing to dispute. So we face very little. I mean, we had a couple of negative comments, but I would say over 15 years or so, I said only one or two comments might have been negative.
I mean, you know, Keith doesn't do a lot of social media, so I might see a little bit more negativity than he does.
Don't care about it.
You know, so those guys are out there. But what I think is interesting is how often, if we're speaking to university students, college students, or young people, where white students will ask, well, why does it matter? I mean, I didn't have anything to do with that history.
Well, Phoebe, wasn't it about an apology or something like that? Somebody said
Oh,
you
why
shouldn't
did I apologize to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that too, right. So it's sort of very hard to understand how several generations later, if you don't feel you have a personal responsibility in the wrongdoing, that you should have to apologize or take any responsibility. But that comes, I think, from a place of ignorance, of not understanding how we move forward with historical legacies and trauma that get carried from generation to generation, and that we must take responsibility as a race and as citizens of this country to acknowledge what has happened, and that we're willing to make the changes necessary. And it's just something we try to, that takes time to sink in with some people who have no experience with this.
Thank you for that question, by the way. Are you staying at the Marriott? I thought I saw you.
So I'm very sorry, we are running short of time, so we only have time for one more question because I have a final closing question for our plenary speakers. So go ahead, mic number 2.
Okay. My name is Akil Kalfani. I'm a professor of sociology and African studies at Essex County College in New Jersey. My question to you is, as you came to find out this information and get the impact of it that it had on you, how did your families both receive it, and how did they respond to the working together and that kind of close-knit impact on you all and the work you're doing?
Interesting. Well, the first thing that happened was, after I pulled that envelope out, I told my sister that, by the way, we're the great-great-granddaughters of Judge John Howard Ferguson, and she said, no, we're not. I said, yes, we are. She said, no, we're not. I said, okay, here's the paper. Anyway, so there was this, it took a while, and then we started working, and then there was, on my side, I think on Key's side too, the fact there was an acceptance that we were committed to sharing this history, to seeing how our working together could have a positive effect, and they embraced it, finally. But they weren't against it ever.
Now, in my case, I would say that when Keith Weldon Medley helped me find a lot of the genealogy research about how I was related to Homer Plessy, I took all those papers, made copies, and sent it to everybody in the family. And I asked a few of them recently, do you have those genealogy papers? They're like, I can't find them. I'm like, so, I'm really in a struggle somewhat to pass it on, but I feel obligated to my family to pass it on to the young people in the family. And I have one niece that lives in California, and she has 2 sons that are scholars and athletes. And I sent the papers to them as well. But my niece would always tell me, now she deals with a lot of social media, and she's pretty popular. She's got this nonprofit called Single Moms Planet, and she's real popular in California. Her name is Nefertiri Plessy. And she would always tell me when I said, well, let me tell you some of this history. She would say, Uncle Keith, that stuff it's not popular. People don't, history is kind of boring, And when we got the pardon for Homer Plessy, but his 125-year-old conviction was removed in the same area where he was arrested at Preston Royal, which is now Homer Plessy Way in Royal, because we had that changed. My niece was being hounded by people in California to do a movie. And she called me and finally said, man, this is serious. I said, I'm like, thank you for telling me that. But we stay in touch now because she's doing interviews with me, and we're recording the history now for the family. So hopefully we'll have a documentary about just that side of the family, the Plessy family. So, but the pardon was so powerful that when the 125-year conviction was removed from Homer Plessy, we had gotten the pardon like months before that, and the news spread that from that morning at 9 o'clock when we were at the Louisiana Board of Pardons on a Zoom with the District Attorney of New Orleans. The news spread from 9 o'clock in the morning to about 4 in the evening. It was all the way in Taiwan, China, and the UK. And we realized how important that was at that point. And we were dodging the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, who else? Yeah, but that was a powerful moment, and it changed a lot for us. It took us to another level. And we got interest from a world peace building organization called Search for Common Ground, if you ever heard of them. I think they're the largest world peace building organization in America. And they sought us out to partner with them on a project, and we're working on that project now with them. And I think more members of the family will probably be coming along soon.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And thank you for your questions. So just to conclude, as we conclude this wonderful conversation, do you have any final thoughts to share or words of advice for international educators on how they can work with people from different backgrounds to create social impact?
Well, I'll start with, since you're thinking.
I thought you were going to ask.
Well, I'll start with just an experience I had on my job. You know, we wear different uniforms at the hotel. I've been working there for 44 years as a bellman. And other departments, engineering, housekeeping, executive office, everybody wears a different outfit. And one of the challenges that we have is to sit across the table at lunch and eat with someone that has a different social background from you. And you find out that you have more in common than you ever thought.
Thank you.
Well, actually, one of the efforts that we're involved in now with this Search for Common Ground grant is about how to bring people together across differences. And it's been a fascinating process because it's kind of pushed us to go out into the communities and interview people in different organizations and individuals in different wards and socioeconomic backgrounds and find out what is working and what isn't working in terms of their goals to reach equity and social and cultural equity. And it's a very interesting process because it involves both doing that research, training coalition leaders to be able to facilitate these meetings where we bring people together across differences and try to have civil conversations and come to some very productive, constructive resolution around problems. And so we're learning new ways of doing that right now, actually.
Thank you both. Thank you both for this wonderful and enriching conversation. It's been a pleasure to share the stage with you. So let's give them one last round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.